"Keep what is yours and leave the rest of the continent to us," so declared the American Secretary of State John Quincy Adams in 1821. The words were meant to reassure the British minister Stratford Canning, but they revealed a monstrous ambition of the American government, the fulfillment of which was to form the basis of relations between the United States and the British Empire for the next century. As the US expanded across North America territorially, and then the world commercially, Britain sporadically attempted to block, challenge, conciliate, and eventually concede to US power. At the time of Adams's quote, though, a British decline in the face of the American challenge was far from certain. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve 7 years before, had ended the War of 1812 but settled nothing. Canada remained a great bastion of British power in the north. The United States had once more survived a struggle with London and effectively broken Indian power in the process. Several border questions remained, and trade restrictions continued to cause friction. Above all, both nations just generally remained suspicious of one another. There were three broad categories disputes between the two states fell into in this time period. The first and most important was the issue of neutral rights in wartime, including the right of search, blockade, and the explosive issue of slavery, for Britain considered itself at war with slavers. The second were issues related to conflicts of interest, for example territorial, fishing, or commercial disputes. The third were issues of high politics, particularly attitudes towards Latin American countries and European involvement in American affairs. The first arguments in the aftermath of Ghent, though, inevitably pertained to commerce. Britain wished to take part in the lucrative interstate carrying trade, whilst the US wanted the British West Indies open to its merchants. It was a sign of how relations were to proceed that an attempt to settle these arguments with the Convention of 1818 produced almost nothing of value on the issue, thanks to intransigence on both sides. There was, however, more success in concluding a settlement over how much Britain would pay in compensation for slaves that had escaped in the war, as well as finalising the Canadian border along the 49th parallel from Lake of the Woods to the Rockies. The main Canada boundary remained unresolved, whilst Oregon, which was also under dispute by both, was to be left open to either nation's citizens and commerce for 10 years. The issue of greatest international importance, which faced the United States between 1814 and 1821, was the collapse of the Spanish Empire. Neither Britain or American interests aligned here, but both agreed that Spain should not reassert its control through the intervention of other European powers, something which would set a dangerous precedent for the future. There was thus theoretically the framework for a type of joint policy, though this was impaired by Washington's perhaps unsurprising tendency to equate British interests in the region with those of the other great powers. The main policy divergence was how to go about engaging with the new countries in rebellion against the Spanish. The British Foreign Secretary, Castlereagh, wished to avoid America recognising the independence of these new states prematurely. This could have potentially forced Britain to do the same, which would undermine the conservative and counter-revolutionary system established at the Congress of Vienna. He did, however, wish to use Spain's problems to at least lever open the formerly mercantilist empire to British trade. By contrast, the Americans were naturally far more willing to recognise, indeed rejoice at, the independence of Spain's colonies. But even for Washington, currently negotiating with Madrid over Florida and the western border, complications abounded. By 1818, Spanish obstinacy in the face of what the British considered were fairly reasonable suggestions meant Castlereagh increasingly leaned towards recognition of the insurgent states, and suggested a joint mediation with Washington once the rebellion's success had been assured. Adams finally understood British policy and reported to Monroe's cabinet, "It is our true policy to let this experiment have its full effect without attempting to disturb it, which might unnecessarily give offence to the Allies. And after it shall have failed, as fail it must, we shall then be at perfect liberty to recognise any of the South American governments without coming into collision with the Allies." But cooperation with Britain had for the moment to be abandoned over a conflict in Florida, In 1818, Jackson, the buccaneering victor of New Orleans, invaded the territory, raising concern in London, which preferred a state so close to the West Indies to remain in the possession of the unthreatening Spanish. The fear was reinforced by Jackson's arbitrary and indefensible execution of 2 British subjects. Public opinion in Britain was apoplectic, but Castlereagh remained calm. He instead attempted to display British goodwill toward the US by pressing the Spanish to sign a treaty in 1819, which allowed for an American occupation of Florida. Though the more cynical US commentator could reasonably have looked at the conquest as a fait accompli for London. Back in Spanish America, Castlereagh's successor, Canning, brought the crisis to a head. In 1823, with the rebellions obviously successful, he announced London would finally recognise the new nations. The United States followed this with the promulgation of its Monroe Doctrine, which declared, "The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as future subjects for colonisation by any European power." The most interesting aspect of this was that it was an assertion of an unenforceable ideal. American resources were unequal to the requirements of such a policy, and hence many in Europe thought it must have been drawn up in cooperation with Canning. This was false, but the disconcertion the impression caused in European courts suited him well enough, and indeed it was the Royal Navy that would stand as guarantor of the doctrine for decades to come. In 1824, Canning declared, "The effect of the ultra-liberalism of our Yankee cooperators on the ultra-despotism of our Aix-la-Chapelle allies gives me just the balance I wanted." The liberation of Spanish America had seemingly delivered an advantageous situation to both powers, but it was Britain that was to reap the rewards, investing heavily in the region over the following century. When Adams, watching South American states swing into the British sphere, belatedly realised this, another rupture in relations was bound to occur. The boiling point came over Cuba, one of the last remaining Spanish holdouts in the New World, and an island coveted by many in Washington. In 1826, the new Latin American republics met to work out some kind of invasion plan. The US should probably have remained quiet and watched the proposed assault either fail or fall apart, as it most likely would have done. Instead, Washington denounced any possible annexation, and thus created the entirely correct impression she had designs on the island herself. Canning further trapped the Americans by proposing a self-denying ordinance on the issue, which they obviously refused. The affair made it clear that whilst British policy was generally based upon commercial interests in Latin America, the United States' were to some degree territorial, a contrast that led much of the region to favour London. Thus, Adams had to recognise the balance of power in the region had shifted against them. On the 3rd of January 1828, Clay told the Republic of Plata that the Monroe Doctrine must not be seen as conveying any pledge or obligation, the performance of which foreign nations have a right to demand. In effect, the Monroe Doctrine had been suspended primarily as a result of British policy. Clay's irritation soon made itself manifest via a resuscitation of petty squabbles. Postures taken up in Congress seemed to suggest an American right to dictate trade policy in the West Indies, an area the British were particularly sensitive. In July 1826, an order in council prohibited all West Indian American trade in American ships. Adams then refused to allow British West Indian men to enter American ports. The result was disastrous for West Indian trade. The fall of Adams did little to improve relations. Jackson, the idol of the Democratic Party, was hardly the man to work with Britain's new Foreign Secretary, Palmerston, who had both an instinctive fear and contempt of Jackson's extension of the suffrage. The US continued its territorial expansion, bringing into question once more the issue of the northern border, and stoking British fears, especially after the Senate refused to accept a very favourable settlement from the Dutch King's arbitration in 1831. The security of Canada, the principal aim of Britain's American policy in this period, was further jeopardised by the 1837 rebellion. Though it was suppressed, it garnered substantial support in the US, and insurgents assembled on the American side of the Niagara. President Van Buren was calm and conciliatory throughout, attempting to control extremists, for which he earned Palmerston's thanks. Yet anti-British feeling ran high. The The MacLeod case of 1840–41 did nothing to assuage passions. Palmerston declared that if MacLeod were executed, there would be war. The Americans gave way, and MacLeod, a fool deserving little sympathy, was released. The major obstacle to good relations, apart from traditional Anglophobia in America and British general high-handedness, was the belief that London was determined to prevent the natural expansion of the United States. Every minor squabble came to be regarded in America as a test of national virility. Territorial disputes continued in the North, and local feeling ran high. In 1841, Webster, the new Secretary of State, proposed more negotiations on the contentious Maine-Canada border. Next August, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty was ratified by the Senate. It was subject to criticism in both countries, but was to prove a lasting settlement, even if it actually assigned the United States less than the award in 1831 had offered. There had also been some attempts in these negotiations to deal with the issue of British naval rights, but the dispute regarding London's power to search vessels was so toxic it ended up being dropped by Webster and Ashburton. It was a problem that refused to go away. In December 1841, the European great powers concluded a treaty granting mutual rights of search. The days of slave traders were clearly numbered, though Washington rejected Aberdeen's invitations to also join the treaty. The reason was partly a paranoia about national sovereignty, which a British right to search would violate, though this was an understandable fear for a young nation, and one that is easy to sympathise with. On this issue in particular, it revealed the United States' immaturity as an international power. British policy elsewhere was less than sensible in this period. The destruction of the Spanish Empire left Mexico the only blocking force to American westward expansion. But its grip on these fringe territories was tenuous and in the late 1830s destroyed by Texas. Aberdeen hoped to set up this new nation as a buffer, but the southern states were in favour of annexation, and all a recognition of independence by Britain in 1840 did was create an unnecessary argument with the US, which justifiably felt insulted by such blatant meddling in their sphere of interest. In 1846, Texas was annexed and the United States made major gains in the war with Mexico that followed. Aberdeen's chickens now came home to roost. The failure of British policy in Texas meant activists urged Polk to press US claims to the disputed Oregon Territory more strongly, believing London had shown itself to be a paper tiger. Thus, by involving British prestige needlessly in a weak case, Aberdeen now had to convince American public opinion that British claims to Oregon were not also bluster. In the 1844 presidential election, the Democratic Party adopted the slogan 54-40 or fight, a reference to the extreme northern limit of the American claim. Aberdeen tried to compromise by suggesting the Columbian River as a border, but Polk declared in his inaugural address that American claims were unquestionable, a statement which was as provocative as it was false. The two nations trembled on the brink of war until, in 1846, faced with a conflict in Mexico, Polk agreed to a compromise that saw the 49th parallel established as a frontier, which, apart from a slight alteration in 1871, decided the American-Canadian border and removed a serious point of conflict. The Oregon dispute in particular revealed some of the abiding weaknesses in Anglo-American relations. There was a fundamental mistrust between the countries. Each nation suspected the other of illegitimate ambitions. British foreign secretaries tended to see the United States as a brash, insensitive power, seeking domination of the New World and its trade. American secretaries of state tended to see Britain as a typical European empire, anti-democratic, imperialist, and hostile to the natural extensions of American power. Bluster and threats thus became a normal part of diplomatic exchanges. Palmerston declared, with such cunning fellows as these Yankees, it never answers to give way, whilst Polk summed up the American position in arguing, the only way to treat John Bull is to look him in the eye. When views such as these were predominant among policymakers, it is hardly surprising that Anglo-American relations could not settle down. Despite the settling of the Oregon dispute in 1848, Polk continued to re-energise the Monroe Doctrine into one of action. The subsequent continued American expansion strained relations in the 1840s, and with threats of annexing Hawaii, politicians like Aberdeen began to wonder if the United States' territorial appetite would ever abate. Central America was the next area of conflict, as both nations sought to extract favourable economic concessions. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was, after much wrangling, concluded between Britain and the US, which stipulated neither will exercise any dominion over any part of Central America, but as so many times before, it meant little in an atmosphere poisoned by suspicion. The tensions continued. In 1852, Spain tried to persuade France, the United States and Britain to join a self-denying ordinance with respect to Cuba. Only Washington refused, and the Secretary of State, Everett, boldly asserted that the manifest destiny of his country would involve the acquisition of all European territories in the Americas. That same year, Pierce, an expansionist, was elected president. It was obvious the struggle in Central America was far from over. Russell brusquely rejected Everett's thesis, and in the following year, Clarendon assailed the Monroe Doctrine itself. Her Majesty's government cannot admit that doctrine as an international axiom which ought to regulate the conduct of European states. Gradually, the two powers drifted towards war once again. The tensions came to a boiling point in 1856 when an American filibuster, William Walker, seized Greytown on the Mosquito Coast. Palmerston pressed for the fleet to be sent and for the chastisement of Nicaragua, which was supporting Walker. Calmer voices prevailed in cabinet, backed by Disraeli and the Commons, who balked at the way Britain seemed ready to fling herself into war. Consequently, for the first time since Canning, there was a genuine attempt to review the basis of British policy towards the United States. As Disraeli observed, if England is to regard every expansion of the United States as an act detrimental to her interests and hostile to her power, we shall be pursuing a course which will involve this country in struggles that may prove of a disastrous character. Britain began recognising that in areas her interests were not significantly at stake, competing with the United States would only be to her detriment. Thus, between 1859 and 1860, a series of treaties were negotiated between Britain and the republics of Central America, surrendering many of the British claims and bringing to an end conflict in this era. Part of the reason for Britain's retreat in these areas was the changing economic relationship between the two. The United States had started the century dependent on imports from British industry. By the 1850s, this was clearly no longer the case, as the United States' own industrialisation began in earnest. US industries began by the end of the century to outpace their British counterparts. They were helped by Britain's dogged commitment to free trade, which allowed the dumping of American products in the imperial market. The United States, by contrast, was highly protectionist, particularly after the 1857 tariff was replaced by Morrall's increase in 1861. This protected US manufacturing from British competition, but was in reality far too high and helped give the country its infamous robber barons. Britain should have retaliated, especially once the immense agricultural potential of the United States was opened up in the 1870s that would swamp Britain's domestic sector, but the dogma of free trade proved too strong, and so the imperial market was increasingly encroached upon by the US. Even so, in 1860 Anglo-American relations were on a much better footing, but the establishment of the Confederacy would bring in a new period of difficulty. Palmerston could barely conceal his hope that the United States would disintegrate. On the whole, however, opinion in Britain was divided over the Civil War. There was sympathy for the Confederacy among certain trading groups, the aristocracy, and those who disliked Yankee arrogance. Anti-slaving groups and radicals tended to prefer the Union. The Civil War itself dealt a great deal of injury to British commerce, as the Union imposed a blockade upon Confederate ports, thus seriously damaging the important cotton trade with Britain. Union supporters were further undermined by the internal politics of the North, which initially restricted Lincoln from taking an unambiguous line on the issue of slavery, thus confusing many as to what the point of the war was. Palmerston, though a man who took extreme joy in making slavers' lives miserable, saw in the Civil War a chance to weaken the US. He was greatly assisted in this effort by Seward, the Secretary of State. His conduct in 1861 verged on the insane. In order to comply with international law, The European trading nations had to recognise the Confederacy as a belligerent power. This did not mean a recognition of sovereignty. At a time when the US was poised on the brink of internal conflict, Seward proposed on the 1st of April that Spain, Britain, Russia and France be asked for precise explanations of their conduct, failing which war was to be declared. This was rank lunacy, and Lincoln unsurprisingly ignored the document, but Seward's hostile attitude towards Britain in particular was well known. Britain received envoys from the Confederacy during the conflict, though no promise to recognise the state was ever given. Seward told Adams, the American ambassador in London, to threaten war if Britain had any communication with so-called commissioners, the domestic enemies of the United States. Adams wisely disregarded this nonsense, but was unable to stop the threat becoming public knowledge. On the whole, however, most American policymakers were aware of the danger this type of recklessness could lead to, especially after troops were dispatched to Canada by Britain in June 1861. And occasionally arbitrary behaviour from the Union notwithstanding, the British cabinet on the whole was committed to neutrality. In August 1861 it resolved not to recognise the Confederacy, even if the South's consistent military success made it a difficult policy to maintain. There was some pressure for Britain to arrange a mediation with France, but it became increasingly apparent that any such intervention would be tantamount to supporting the Confederacy. The greatest threat to the policy of neutrality came from Union actions against British ships. In the past, there had been American support for the rights of neutrals and British claims for belligerents. During the Civil War, these roles were reversed. In November 1861, the Trent Affair erupted when a Union sloop stopped a British steamer and took off 2 Confederate diplomats bound for London. This was a serious error of judgment, for not only was the Confederate mission doomed to failure, it was the only conceivable issue that could bring Britain into the conflict. Palmerston demanded the diplomats' return, believing this would lead to war, but Seward, in a remarkable volte-face, convinced Lincoln's cabinet to give way. The Trent debacle was the most serious, though not the only diplomatic breach between the two powers. Others included an argument over the Alabama, a privateer built in England that was widely known to be being constructed for the Confederacy. Russell failed to block the ship's departure, which Palmerston subsequently admitted was a mistake. With the war's end, the United States demanded compensation for the loss in shipping that had resulted from its raiding. Claims such as this weren't settled until the Treaty of Washington in 1871, by which Britain agreed to pay $15.5 million in compensation, in return for about half that from the United States to cover the damage done to Canadian trade. Overall, however, the threat of Britain ever intervening in the Civil War was always remote. There were nonetheless attempts to take advantage of America's inability to uphold Polk's aggressive version of the Monroe Doctrine. In May 1861, Spain reasserted control over Santo Domingo, though her authority collapsed within 4 years. A more serious threat to US interests occurred with a Franco-Spanish invasion of Mexico in 1862, over a moratorium on debt repayments. Palmerston had originally wanted to act in concert with these powers, but after a separate agreement with the Mexicans, decided he would have no part in Napoleon III's plans for regime change. Britain subsequently pressured Spain to withdraw her contingent. France was not to be so easily dissuaded. Only with the death of Maximilian of Austria, Paris's candidate for the Mexican throne in 1867, did her involvement cease. The Mexican affair strengthened Anglo-American relations as it confirmed the trend begun in Central America of Britain slowly detaching itself from the United States' sphere of influence. With the end of the Civil War in the Union's favour and the exponential economic growth that followed, it became increasingly apparent that Britain could not maintain its position as both a rival of the United States in the Americas and the European powers of the continent. Britain subsequently came to finally regard the US as a great power, and thus began altering her policy accordingly, avoiding clashes she may previously have taken up. But it was to be a long time until friendship became the basis of relations. Under Gladstone and Disraeli's ministries in the 1870s and 80s, the trend of recognising America as a great power continued. This did not, however, mean an end to disputes between the two. In the final decades of the century, many Americans believed their country had to control an Isthmian canal. but Britain had no interest in scrapping the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which provided for joint ownership and operation of such a waterway. If Britain felt compelled to impose its designs upon other peoples, a frustrated New York Herald opined, it should take another turn at the Boers, the Zulus, or the Afghans. She need not bother with this side of the sea. We are a good enough England for this hemisphere. On the whole, however, as the US grew in strength and became more prepared to display it in the Americas, Britain tended to try and avoid friction on a case-by-case basis, though without a significant reorientation in strategy. It fell to Salisbury to actually undertake a long overdue change in British policy. As a dyed-in-the-wool illiberal Tory, he had his class's instinctive fear of the United States, but he also understood Britain could no longer put off the need to once and for all deal with the lasting areas of friction between the two countries. The spark for this change came in 1895, when the US Secretary of State, Olney, turned an old boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana into a brash reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine. Salisbury originally tried to stall, presumably in the hope the Americans would get bored, but was overruled by the cabinet, which feared escalation at a time of heightened tensions with Europe. "We expect the French to hate us," Selborne declared, "but the Americans, no." Consequently, Britain agreed to US arbitration, a concession which Washington repaid with a settlement favourable to Britain in the dispute. London had in effect tacitly accepted the Monroe Doctrine meant American hegemony in the hemisphere. Salisbury and his successor at the Foreign Office, Lansdowne, then moved to eliminate all remaining sources of tension, relinquishing British claims to Central America, where the US intended to build a canal, on Alaska's boundary, where Canadian interests were sacrificed, and in the Spanish-American War of 1898, where Britain, as the only European power not openly hostile to the United States, wrecked German attempts to form an anti-American bloc. The Spanish-American War in many ways marked the penultimate evolution in the Anglo-American relationship. Almost overnight, the United States carved out for itself a seat at the world table, and showed itself to be an imperial power, capable of projecting strength globally. Culturally and economically, American influence was now also becoming more pervasive. US capital began to spread in South America, once the almost sole domain of British investors. When a Russian famine occurred in 1891, it was Americans that organised enormous relief efforts, and most horrifically for the British, it was noted that by the end of the century, baseball was more popular than cricket in Japan. It was testament to how successful the change in attitudes in both countries had been that this newfound imperial status did not herald another era of rivalry. On the contrary, in the opening decade of the 20th century, the presidency of Roosevelt showed it was now possible to combine the previously mutually exclusive beliefs of American expansionism and a somewhat pro-British stance. Roosevelt found a use for his country's rapidly growing economic strength in the creation of a large battle fleet. It was again a testament to the increasingly warm relations that, though Britain was nervous about the expansion, it provoked nothing like the reaction Germany's naval programme did. In large part, this was because Roosevelt and Taft's expansionism was never truly embraced by the American public, and after 1908 their ambitions were reined in by a sceptical Congress. There was also the basic strategic fact that US sea power was hobbled by the need to defend two oceans, and if a war with the United States had become unpalatable to London, it was no more thinkable in Washington. British naval supremacy was, declared Roosevelt, the great guarantee for the peace of the world. For him, the purpose of the US Navy was not to compete with Britain, but to be a junior member of an informal two-power alliance that would secure Anglo-American interests. This closer union was reflected socially. America's Gilded Age was also the era of the dollar princess in Britain. Young heiresses from the continent's industrial tycoon families were shipped off to rescue a cash-strapped British nobility, Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough, being the most famous and tragic case, though Mary Leiter, married to George Curzon, later Viceroy of India, was a more happy example. With the advent of social Darwinism, notions of race also became a factor in relations for the first time since the Revolution. Some American statements of this era could have been penned by the first revolutionary patriots when they were still attempting to be more English than the English. The United States was bound, proclaimed one senator, to become a greater England with a nobler destiny. The feeling was reciprocated in some parts of Britain. Cecil Rhodes dreamed of a hegemonic British Empire with which America would have willingly reunited. Joseph Chamberlain proclaimed his belief that an alliance between the two countries was the best guarantee for world peace, and Winston Churchill's American mother, Jenny, heavily invested in the pro-American Anglo-Saxon Review, typically just in time to lose money on it. These were, of course, not opinions universally shared in either country, and there was little wish for a formal alliance among the actual policymakers in Washington or London. Even so, by 1914, Anglo-American relations were better than in any period since the Revolution. British possessions in the New World were secure, and capital from the City of London remained dominant. But it was clear that in the Latin world and the Caribbean, the United States had become the hegemon. The contest over who would dominate the Americas was over. 1914 would bring about the start of a new competition for control of the world. Upon the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, there seemed little reason on either side of the Atlantic to suppose that the conflict should involve the United States, though a small minority, including Roosevelt, began to press for American intervention on the side of the Entente. The Wilson administration declared the country's neutrality with popular support. This suited Britain well enough in 1914. However, once hopes for a short conflict had been swept aside, potential problems in the Anglo-American relationship began to reveal themselves. British strategy relied on using the strength of the Royal Navy to blockade the Central Powers. The nature of blockade inevitably meant intercepting American trade with the European continent to starve Germany of supplies. At the start of the conflict, Britain defined the parameters of the blockade fairly laxly. As a result of fierce American protests, contraband was limited to just war material and supplies destined for the German military. Berlin's decision to engage in unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915, however, saw Britain widen the definition of contraband to include almost all goods being imported into Germany. The fact that Britain had only expanded the blockade in response to German naval actions made it harder for the United States to decisively contest, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 by a German U-boat led to the death of 128 Americans, with the manifest showing it was carrying small arms ammunition not being considered sufficient justification for the German action. It also helped that whereas British diplomats were patient and accommodating where possible with Washington's concerns, and extremely careful in tailoring their policy not to overstep the limit of the American public's goodwill, their German counterparts tended to display a high-handed disregard for US opinions. Nonetheless, tensions with Washington over the blockade remained fraught. It was the last straw, fulminated Wilson, when Britain and France blacklisted American firms accused of trading with the enemy in 1916. In response, he authorized another enormous program of naval expansion, awarding $500 million over 3 years. "Let us build a navy bigger than hers, and do what we please," he declared. Blockade was just one area of friction in the war. The other considerable issue until 1917 was the question of finance. At the start of the conflict, London was the centre of the world's economic system, and other members of the Entente rapidly became dependent on Britain to underwrite their war efforts. Funding this meant an extraordinary amount of borrowing, particularly for Britain, which by 1916 negotiated loans on behalf of all Entente members. As collateral, the Treasury drew on Britain's reserves and immense overseas investments, organising, for example, a forced purchase scheme for private holdings of first-class North and Latin American securities, which were exchanged for domestic government bonds. These foreign assets then provided security for the billions of dollars worth of Entente borrowing from Wall Street. The fundamental change in the Anglo-American relationship for the rest of the century occurred here. To fund the war effort, Britain had taken to effectively borrowing from private investors in the United States, facilitated mainly by JP Morgan, and crucially in dollars. Britain could have avoided this dependence on the United States, but to oversimplify, it would have involved cannibalising her own economy in the grossly irresponsible way Berlin did, as well as reducing the tempo of offensives due to a lack of dollars with which Britain could buy material from the US. Thus, by the end of July 1916, American investors had staked $2 billion on an Entente victory. The problem facing the Wilson administration was that this would soon make the United States' investment in the Entente war effort too big to fail. For Wilson, the rapidly mounting British debt promised to cause real problems for his grand strategy. Unlike Roosevelt, who saw the war as a chance for the US to finally establish itself as a great power equal to the Europeans via intervention in the conflict, Wilson believed it was an opportunity to usurp them totally, without intervention. He hoped to use Britain's increasing dependence on Wall Street to end the war on American terms, which, outlined vaguely in 1916, involved freedom of the seas and limitations on armaments, kept in check by an association of nations the United States would join and presumably lead. As discussed, however, there was a real risk of American investors becoming too committed to the Entente war effort, shortening Wilson's window of opportunity to act decisively. It was in this context a clash between Washington and London became inevitable. The Lloyd George government that came to power in December 1916 remained Atlanticist in its outlook. If the United States would stand by Great Britain, the entire world could not shake the combined mastery we would hold over the seas, Lloyd George had earlier declared to Colonel House, but its faith was to be badly shaken. On the 27th of November, as JP Morgan prepared to launch a new Anglo-French bond issue to raise $1.5 billion for the war effort, Wilson pushed the Federal Reserve, against its better judgment, to announce it was no longer desirable for American investors to increase their holdings in British and French securities. Wall Street plunged and sterling was offloaded by investors en masse. JP Morgan and the British Treasury were forced into emergency purchasing of sterling to prop it up. The British cabinet concluded that Wilson meant to force them to end the war within weeks by throttling its ability to borrow. Wilson raised the temperature further when he issued his peace note on December the 18th, calling on both sides to state what aims could justify the war's continuation. It was an open effort to delegitimise the conflict. In London and Paris, the reaction was immediate. George V is said to have wept, the cabinet was furious, the London Times was dismayed that Wilson had implied there was no difference between the two sides. Fortunately for the Entente, the Central Powers rejected the President's offer of mediation first, allowing them to do the same. The war would continue, but Britain's dependence on American finance to wage it continued to grow, and since the abandonment of the abortive bond issue in December, Britain's financial situation in Washington was perilous. To cover purchases in the US running at $75 million per week, in January 1917, Britain could muster no more than $215 million in assets in New York. Beyond that, it would be forced to use the Bank of England's last remaining gold reserves, which would cover no more than 6 weeks of procurement. The only solution if Britain wanted to still fight the war with American goods was to ask JP Morgan to relaunch the abortive bond issue, and once again reckon with the President. On the 22nd of January, Wilson explicitly staked the United States' claim for world leadership with a speech to the Senate that called for a new international order based on a League of Nations. He outlined his wish for a peace without victory, or, in his mind, a peace of mutual exhaustion for the European powers, including Britain, from which the United States could emerge as the global leader of a new international order. Although Wilson viewed himself as playing the disinterested neutral, all he had really done was leave the door open for Germany, which then held the upper hand territorially, to win this peace without victory. The German ambassador, Bernstorff, correctly surmised that Wilson's continued throttling of the financial markets would be far more useful in Germany's war against Britain than any U-boat campaign. As always, however, OHL could be relied upon to astonish the world with its almost mystical ability to pick the completely wrong option. On the 31st of January, the US was officially informed that unrestricted submarine warfare, suspended after American protests in 1915, was to resume. On the 3rd of February, Congress approved the breaking of diplomatic relations with Germany. Wilson was to be robbed of his chance to play the role of global peace arbiter. Many in Wilson's administration now wanted to commit the nation fully to the Entente, and despite the fact that such an alliance may well upend London's leadership of the nations ranged against Germany, Britain was quick to push for the entry of the United States. Morgan's cannot be regarded as a substitute for the proper diplomatic authorities, announced the ambassador to Washington. But Wilson continued to delay a full commitment, insisting greater justice would be done if the conflict ended in a draw. It was finally the lunatic, even by OHL standards, Zimmerman telegram which invited Mexico to attack the US that finally forced Wilson's hand. On April the 2nd, he abandoned once and for all his hopes of America playing the disinterested arbiter and asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Even now, however, Washington's support was qualified. The United States did not join the conflict as a full member of the Entente, but as an associate power. Wilson was determined that the US was still to play the role of world arbiter he had arranged for it. Even so, it cannot be understated how important American entry was for the Entente war effort. In the summer of 1917, there was a very real risk of Britain defaulting on its loans from Wall Street since 1915. The US declaration of war thus provided enormous relief, with Washington providing Britain an unprecedented $250 million advance in April, with over $3 billion to follow pending congressional approval. The fact it took Congress longer than expected showed just how dependent Britain had become on the US. In the last days of June 1917, Britain came within hours of insolvency. But with the US as a co-belligerent, the real risk to Britain and the Entente was gone. Instead of the uncertainty surrounding private finance from Wall Street, Britain was now able to rely on the more stable government-to-government lending. American troops arrived slower than expected to Europe, so much so that the Entente came within a hair's breadth of losing the war in the 1918 German offensives. Britain might be forced into complete dependence on the United States to protect against a German-dominated Europe, shrieked some hysterical British statesmen. Ultimately, the crisis unified rather than split the alliance, and British shipping was freed up to rush 250,000 Americans across the Atlantic every month in mid-1918. Their contribution in the actual fighting was mainly in psychological rather than quantifiable military terms. The arrival of American troops undoubtedly buoyed the morale of all Entente armies, though it was largely Anglo-French troops and material that delivered the string of shattering blows to the German military in late 1918 and forced them to an armistice. The question of who would dictate the peace was then an open-ended one. Britain and France had undeniably won the war against Germany, yet they had done it on the back of American finance, which factor entitled which power to a greater voice at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 wasn't clear. Although American negotiators realised the practical necessity of working with Britain in particular, Wilson certainly believed he knew who should dictate the terms. He declared the US would force them to our way of thinking when the war was over. By that time, he calculated, they will be financially in our hands. In early 1918, Wilson had announced his 14 points as the basis for any peace. These lofty principles concealed the weakness that, according to Keynes, the president had thought out nothing. When it came to practice, his ideas were nebulous and incomplete. He had no plan, no scheme, no constructive ideas. Or as Clemenceau more bluntly put it, God has his 10 commandments, Wilson his 14 points, we shall see. Europe did see. Wilson's greatest contribution to the New World Order, sanctimony aside, was the League of Nations, an internationalist body designed to prevent future conflicts. Yet it was immediately rendered ineffective by the United States' refusal to join. Republicans in particular feared the wide commitments of the League threatened American sovereignty. The US would give back to George V what it took away from George III, warned William Burr, and Britain, the only other great power, was in no position to enforce the League on her own. British delegates hardly distinguished themselves as far-sighted visionaries either, and there were as many conflicting aims in the British party as there were statesmen attending the conference. Lloyd George, the deceiving, half-human, goat-footed bard in Keynes's view, wasn't much trusted by anyone, and thus his attempts to bridge the gap between French revanchism and American idealism were always destined to be inadequate. The ultimate Versailles settlement, followed by further treaties with the other Central Powers, helped set the stage for another more disastrous war. An attempt to apply the Wilsonian principle of self-determination to an ancient continent crisscrossed by the racial and dynastic wars of a millennium proved unstable from the start. The immediate post-war era did nothing to reverse the new financial balance between Washington and London. Britain was owed around 4 times the £1 billion it owed the United States, though Balfour announced she would only collect what was needed to pay her debts to Washington, an offer that actually came off looking underhanded to both the French and the Americans. Britain continually asked the US to join in some form of debt write-down with them, to no avail. Wilson did offer to extend the deferral of interest that had previously been arranged on British loans, but wanted in return a formal commitment to avoid any discrimination against American trade in the imperial market, furiously rejected by the Chancellor. Britain's precarious financial position was worsened when debt repayment terms were finally arranged with the US in 1923. These saw London agree to repay $160 million a year, far in excess of what the Treasury thought feasible. Poor old Bonar Law, the new Prime Minister, was reduced to complaining anonymously in the Times. It was a remarkable turnaround in the financial relationship between the two powers, although the ultimate display of the new basis for Anglo-American relations had been a year earlier at the 1922 Washington Naval Conference. At the conference, Britain, who in a striking bit of symbolism was invited on the same terms as Italy and France, agreed to naval parity in capital ships with the United States. It was a very public display that Britannia no longer ruled the waves. Only 10 years earlier, Britain had convincingly defeated German attempts to challenge the Royal Navy's supremacy. Now, a simple threat from Washington of a renewed naval arms race saw Britain agree to formally give up its hegemony over the oceans for good. 1922 confirmed what had been known even before 1914, that the United States was now a great power capable of rivaling the British Empire in almost every conceivable way. The Washington Naval Treaty marked a turning point in the Anglo-American relationship. Though Balfour actually gained most of what Whitehall had wanted at the negotiations, the United States established itself, both symbolically and practically, as Britain's equal, and Washington's intention to use this newfound power became immediately clear. During the treaty negotiations, America had lobbied for an end to the Anglo-Japanese alliance in the Pacific. For 20 years, this had provided overstretched British naval resources immense relief in the Far East. Now, the possibility arose of negotiations stalling, and a naval race with the US that Britain could ill afford if the alliance was not jettisoned. The cabinet was divided. Curzon and the imperialist wing viewed Washington as unreliable and unlikely to offer much in the way of compensation. Pro-American figures like Churchill, however, believed satiating the US was worth the potential trouble of an unbound Japan, a completely correct assessment with absolutely no problems 20 years down the line. When a British statesman voiced reservations about dropping the alliance to the incoming Secretary of State, Hughes, his response was a masterclass in diplomatic subtlety. "You would not be here to speak for Britain," Hughes ranted. "You would not be here speaking anywhere. England would not be able to speak at all. It is the Kaiser who would be heard if America, seeking nothing for herself but to save England, had not plunged into the war and won it. And you speak of obligations to Japan?" British politicians grumbled, but it was decided avoiding the ire of Hughes, let alone that of the whole United States, was preferable to Japanese friendship. On the whole, however, Washington did not as yet seek to challenge the British Empire. Isolation is really a misnomer for American policy in the interwar era, but it is true London was left in relative peace to police its imperium without interference. On the other hand, the refusal to join the League of Nations did not mean the United States gave up its influential presence in world affairs. The main issue in Anglo-American, indeed European-American relations in the 1920s was the problem of reparation and debt repayments. European nations were burdened with exorbitant post-war bills, most of them owed to the United States. The Republican administrations of the 1920s were generally sympathetic to the predicament of the US's wartime co-belligerents, but their hands were to an extent tied. Outright debt cancellation, like the French agitated for, would shift the burden onto American taxpayers and spark domestic revolt. Even so, settlements could be generous. Mussolini's Italy was given an agreement which forgave 75% of its debt to the US, and before the French refused it as an insult, a similar offer was made to Paris. But these solutions had the impact of seriously annoying British statesmen, who had been given nothing like so generous terms, and were still devoting most of their country's income to repayments. British attrition in the war, particularly in the financial arena, was far less obvious than the systematic destruction of northern France by the Germans, thus it was harder to elicit sympathy from Washington. And besides, few American politicians seriously wanted Britain to so easily wriggle off the hook and reassert any form of economic dominance. Even more annoying for Britain and France was the regular US badgering about lowering German reparations. The British and French agreed, but on condition that the US wrote down their war debts that the German indemnity was supposed to pay. Again, Washington refused to link the two. This petty selfishness on both sides of the Atlantic did more than anything else to create rifts in the interwar period. The relationship was not helped by the fundamental uncertainties of the post-war world order. Prior to 1914, the global financial system had centred on the City of London, but the consequences of the war for Britain, ranging from the liquidation of its overseas assets to its abandonment of the gold standard and its exorbitant debt, meant in whose image global trade was to be reconstructed was uncertain. Both sides of the Atlantic naturally wanted the system to play to their inherent advantages. The US, with enormous gold reserves, trade surpluses and political debt receipts, wanted a market-regulated gold standard to truly maximise American economic advantages. In contrast, Britain, with relatively meagre gold reserves, a problem trade and high debt, wanted an internationally regulated gold exchange standard, with separate currency areas for the dollar and pound. These two systems effectively coexisted unhappily for the first part of the 1920s, before the Dominions, South Africa in particular, accepted American suggestions to return to gold without Britain if necessary. This meant London faced the prospect of restricted trade within its own empire, and thus the Chancellor, Churchill, took the decision to revert to the gold standard in 1925. But with free trade in a pound overvalued by about 10%, British exports suffered dreadfully in the consequent period of deflation. Financial competition thus remained a sticking point throughout the interwar period. The US continued its policy of high tariff walls, allowing her industries to build up economies of scale. Britain, contrastingly, voted against any implementation of tariffs, and so continued the economic self-flagellation that had been the cornerstone of the country's policy since the 1840s. Armaments was another issue that plagued Anglo-American relations. Coolidge called the first of several ill-fated disarmament conferences in 1927 between Britain, the US and Japan. It quickly became a farce and descended into petty squabbling over cruiser strength. For the British, it in their mind showed how dangerous placing any reliance on the US would be. American policy was solely about getting a good election cry for Coolidge by saying they had not only made a further peace move, but also twisted the British lion's tail by making him reduce his cruiser strength, muttered Bridgman, who also thought US delegates were not only very conceited, but often very stupid. Unsurprisingly then, the Americans were of the opinion Britain seemed to have lost none of its old imperial arrogance. It would, however, be wrong to over-exaggerate disagreements in this period. Although both nations famously had war plans drawn up in case of a conflict with one another, never did tensions rise to the level of the mid-19th century, and by the late 1920s, issues surrounding reparations and debt repayments seemed to have finally disappeared from the diplomatic conversation, as American loans to Germany allowed Berlin to pay the reparations with which Britain and France could repay Washington. But suspicions remained on both sides. Hankey's exasperated protests sum up the British view succinctly. Time and time again we have been told that if we made this concession or that concession, we should secure goodwill in America. We have given up the Anglo-Japanese alliance, we agreed to pay our debts, and we have again and again made concessions on this ground. I believe we are less popular and more abused in America than ever before, because they think us weak. US statesmen, on the other hand, were befuddled by the British belief that they were owed something for a war many Americans increasingly saw as a mistake, summed up in Coolidge's exasperated cry of, "They hired the money, didn't they?" In 1929, Wall Street plunged and the world economy sank into depression. Hoover reacted with the rightly condemned Smoot-Hawley tariff, excessive even by American standards. With Europe reeling, in 1931 he announced a one-year moratorium on debt repayment, mainly in a bid to save American loans to Germany. But in long-suffering France, the depression and cancellation of German reparations in 1932, on the false impression their debts would follow, proved to be the final straw, and Paris announced a suspension of debt repayments to Britain and America until international circumstances were more favourable. This caused a serious crisis in London. The US still refused to contemplate even a debt write-down, let alone forgiveness, and Hoover forced Britain to renew their payments in full in 1932. Hopes that the incoming President, Roosevelt, would be more flexible were immediately dashed. He demanded at least what he called token repayments, until even this small mercy was crushed by Congress's passing of the Johnson Act, which prohibited loans to foreign governments behind on instalments. Britain now faced an upcoming payment of $262 million in June 1934, without either French or Russian support, whilst even German reparations had dried up. This, coupled with the ascendancy of Hitler in Berlin, raising the spectre of costly rearmament, finally proved too much. Britain announced it would suspend further payments. The limbo this debt was left in remains its status today. Washington has not forgiven it, but neither does it actively seek repayment, as doing so would probably ruin the increasingly impoverished modern British economy. H.G. Nicholas perhaps best summed up this whole sordid business. It is impossible to follow the course of the so-called war debt controversy without a feeling of disgust and irritation at the stupidity, insensitivity and small-mindedness by almost all participants. In the aftermath of this sorry episode, however, there was a very rare outbreak of economic competence in London under the careful stewardship of Neville Chamberlain. Having been forced from the gold standard in 1931, Britain finally implemented a very moderate form of imperial preference the next year, at long last offering British manufacturers some protection from American industries. Combined with the policy of a balanced budget, Britain's recovery from the Depression was quicker than Washington's. However, the abandonment of wartime debt, the implementation of tariffs, and the competitive devaluations London undertook throughout the decade all combined to infuriate America. It meant as the dictators gained strength throughout the 1930s, the rift between Britain and the United States, who together could have contained any threat, was too wide for joint action. Neither power was moved to act over the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Back in Europe, as Germany once again emerged as a threat to European peace, there was little hope in London that the United States would be of much help. It was always best and safest to count on nothing from the Americans except words, Chamberlain said. For the majority of British statesmen, their estimation of the United States was barely describable, and part of the reason for Chamberlain's caution in the lead-up to the war was his acceptance that Britain would not be able to draw on the US this time. As a conflict became more likely, Congress passed the Johnson and Neutrality Acts. These restricted the sale of war material to belligerents and blocked the ability of those states that had defaulted on their great war debts to borrow. If Britain and France then ended up in a long war with Germany, which they could well do if they went into the conflict unprepared, their ability to finance the campaign would be severely restricted. As the true barbarism of the German regime became apparent with events such as Kristallnacht and the occupation of Prague, US opinion began to shift. Though the public remained staunchly isolationist, Roosevelt in particular began searching for ways to assist the Allies. Upon entering the Second World War, Chamberlain in no way imagined the United States would be involved. It was hoped and expected Britain would be able to buy from the New World and overcome Germany in part by drawing on the US's immense resources, but the war was always expected to be confined to Europe. Yet Roosevelt was not sitting idly by. Even as German panzers prepared to tear through France, he announced his intention to build 60,000 aircraft. If the US shared the seas with the Royal Navy, the president was making it clear the US Air Force was to dominate the skies, whatever the outcome of the war. Roosevelt and most Americans, indeed most commentators, expected an eventual Anglo-French victory. Instead, it took 6 weeks for the Germans to slice through Allied lines and capture Paris. Britain, whose plan had rested upon using the large French army to blunt any German attack, faced its most catastrophic strategic position since the treaties of Tilsit. Chamberlain, always sceptical of American intentions, had been replaced by Churchill in May. Though privately deeply pessimistic about the British position, in cabinet he fought off suggestions of a compromise peace from the likes of Halifax. Key to the half-American Churchill's defence was the argument that intervention from the United States was genuinely close, that if Britain only held out, America surely must come to the aid of her groaning brother. Whether this was naivety, delusion, or absurd optimism, it was nonetheless a useful argument that helped Churchill overcome, if not convince, his doubters in the moment of crisis. The British Empire would continue the war, but it was apparent that aid was seriously needed. Yet for the time being, that aid was scarce. The Neutrality Acts tied Roosevelt's hands a great deal. Fewer than 3% of the American public supported entering the war, and the president's main concern in this period was that the Royal Navy should not fall into German hands if Britain was defeated. The ambassador, Kennedy, was scathing about Britain's chances in the war, and has since been reviled as a defeatist, but as John Charmley says, his real crime was to have reported unsentimentally on one of the most sentimentalised moments in recent British history. Churchill continued to cling to the hope that American entry was on the horizon. He positively leapt on Roosevelt's Charlottesville speech of June the 10th, where the president spoke of extending aid full speed ahead to the Allies. But Roosevelt was aghast at Churchill's trust in American intervention. Whatever the president's aims, something not easy to decipher, his hands were tied by an isolationist-dominated Congress and an election in November. Of course, neither Roosevelt or the American public were totally indifferent to Britain's plight. Even in 1939, the president had begun to chip away at the Neutrality Acts. In November, he persuaded Congress to agree to an amendment that would allow belligerents to buy from the United States so long as they paid in full and provided transportation, a system known as cash and carry. Since the Germans lacked the foreign exchange and access to the Atlantic, the amendment favoured Britain. Once France fell, Roosevelt was informed Britain had only the gold and dollar reserves to finance purchases on a cash and carry basis for a few months. He knew to continue supporting Britain he would have to stretch his legal authority. Using questionable pretexts, the administration raided depleted US arsenals for 500,000 rifles, 80,000 machine guns, 130 million rounds of ammunition, 975mm guns, and 1 million shells before shipping them to Britain. It wasn't enough, and by the end of 1940, British coffers were virtually empty. As the ambassador to Washington, Lord Lothian, simply put it to American reporters, "Britain's broke, it's your money we want." But Congress wasn't so easily persuaded. Suspicious that the British were hiding their true financial position, a Treasury official had to set out a complete list of London's holdings, securities, gold, and direct investments. Roosevelt announced his intention to provide further aid to Britain, with the analogy of lending a neighbour one's garden hose to put out a fire. The analogy struck a chord with the American public and gave the president a fighting chance in passing what became known as the Lend-Lease Act. But Congress still demanded its pound of flesh. The US Treasury Secretary had to explain and testify before the House Foreign Affairs Committee the depths of British penury. It was utter and complete humiliation for a once mighty empire, driven home when the Lend-Lease Act was symbolically introduced as HR 1776, just in case the empire hadn't quite yet realised the new dynamic in the relationship. The act became law on the 11th of March 1941, and Churchill was later to describe it as the most unsordid act in the whole of recorded history. But the Prime Minister misunderstood the purpose of the act and how costly it would turn out to be. As Ben Style says, Lend-Lease was not intended as an act of generosity. Roosevelt contrived it as a stopgap means of keeping Germany and Japan at bay. That it happened also to be essential to Britain's survival was largely incidental. Indeed, the bill by no means came without strings. For the rest of the war, US officials would use Lend-Lease to relentlessly demand financial and trade concessions that would eliminate Britain as a rival completely in the post-war world. And in spite of all this, American intervention still seemed unlikely. As 1941 continued, Churchill's promises of US aid from a year earlier seemed to ring more hollow by the day. Although tensions between Washington and Berlin rose steadily, to the extent there was in effect an undeclared war between the Kriegsmarine and US Navy in the Atlantic, Roosevelt still stood little chance of changing public opinion, and the hostility towards the British Empire became, if anything, more prevalent among some US statesmen, Roosevelt among them. At a meeting between Churchill and the President in August, Britain and America agreed on the Atlantic Charter, Article 3 of which committed both to supporting the self-determination of all peoples. Though Churchill hurriedly announced this in no way applied to the British Empire, the symbolic impact of the document was unmistakable. In 1940, Britain ceased to be a serious competitor to the United States. The only question now was who would dominate the whole Britain was about to leave, Washington or Berlin. In this sense, Churchill still ironically held the balance of the future world order in his hands that year. Only the choice was not how to preserve London's place in it, but who would inherit, to paraphrase A.J.P. Taylor, the British succession, America or Germany. Churchill and the cabinet, though not realising it at the time, chose to fall back on the United States. No one really foresaw the price that would be extracted. Indeed, no one could possibly be sure the gamble would even result in US intervention. but the choice was made nonetheless. As it was, the decision to count on American intervention in the war was in the end correct, though not for the reasons of kinship or brotherly love as expected. It was aggression from another part of the world entirely that was to finally cement the uneasy alliance. The Second World War fundamentally changed course for Britain on December 7th, 1941, with the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor and subsequent entry of the United States into the conflict. Yet in the immediate aftermath, there was no guarantee America would actually declare war on Germany as well. Public opinion was outraged with the perpetrators of the attack in Tokyo, not Berlin, and though the Anglo-American staff talks had long agreed on a Germany first strategy in case of war with the Axis, it seemed unlikely Roosevelt would be able to convince Congress to declare such a war in the near future. He was saved from this dilemma by the Germans, who apparently decided a battle with the US was inevitable, and thus it was better to declare war now. It's hard to overstate what a relief the United States' entry into the conflict was for Britain. It meant outright defeat, though still possible, no longer seemed likely. Even with Rommel causing chaos in Africa, the Soviet Union on the brink, and southern England still being bombarded, Churchill's once ludicrous war aim of total victory appeared like less of a pipe dream. In 1945, both the American and British empires would stand as decisive victors, but behind the scenes, the diplomats and politicians, rather than the generals, would ensure that only one emerged as global hegemon. As Washington and London were now fighting as allies, Churchill expected that all quarrels over Lend-Lease would be a thing of the past. He couldn't have been more wrong. Since the final master agreement was still to be signed, US diplomats remained relentless in their pursuit of a firm commitment on the abolition of imperial preference, the modest tariff wall that protected the empire from outside competition. This was reiterated in Article 7 that demanded an explicit agreement to end trade discrimination. Churchill and the cabinet protested vigorously at such an intervention in the empire's internal affairs. Reluctantly, the State Department came up with a compromise where London was assured that for now, Article 7 did not imply specific commitments about imperial preference. With these promises in mind, on the 23rd of February 1942, the Mutual Aid Agreement was signed. This did not settle the debate over American aid permanently, and throughout the war, US public opinion would often swing sporadically against more assistance whenever there was talk about British perfidy. Worried by rumours that London was using Lend-Lease goods to undercut US manufacturers in Latin American markets, Hopkins proposed that British exports be limited to historical specialities like whiskey and Harris Tweed. The British economist sent over to negotiate, John Maynard Keynes, sarcastically suggested they might consider adding haggis. The US Treasury especially was keen to ensure the aid provided was the minimum amount needed for Britain to prosecute the war without rebuilding its strength or power. Morgenthau hoped to restrict Lend-Lease to just a narrowly defined list of war materials, with the British reverting back to paying cash for goods such as sugar, fish and paper. This would ensure London's gold and dollar reserves were kept permanently low and Britain permanently weak. Whitehall was saved from this predicament by Cordell Hull, who viewed Britain as a key part of his future plan for a United Nations, which required her to be strong enough to undertake some independent action. Hull allowed knowledge of the Treasury's aims to become public, which led once again to Churchill protesting vigorously. For the sake of the alliance, Roosevelt quashed Morgenthau's agenda. Even American diplomats such as Dean Acheson were annoyed by the Treasury's activities, which, in his view, envisaged a victory where both enemies and allies were prostrate, enemies by military action, allies by bankruptcy. It's worth noting here the interesting comparison with the Soviet Union, also a recipient of Lend-Lease. After its invasion in June 1941, Roosevelt authorized an enormous order of material and $1 billion worth of credit. In return, the US demanded nothing. The humour, of course, is that liberal Britain was driven effectively to the poorhouse by Washington as its price for survival. By comparison, the Soviet Union, heartland of the communist world, could hardly have been better treated. The reality is this was not a matter of ideology. Russia had little it could offer the United States other than resisting German hegemony in the short term. The British Empire, however, had the collective fruits of an imperial project dating back centuries, ripe for the taking. The framing of this as a wholesale American plunder of Britain in her time of need, however, is not remotely accurate and can go too far. It was of course not the United States' fault that London had got herself into such a hopeless predicament, and she was well within her rights to demand concessions, even if they were stringent, in return for what was an enormous amount of economic aid, which, it must be stressed, would amount eventually to something like $22 billion worth that would not have to be paid back. Yet it is also true that American diplomats did not conceal their hope that the British Empire would be wound up at the end of the war, or preferably even before it. This was not just a matter of realpolitik and geopolitical competition. Anti-colonial sentiment ran deep in the American mind. In October 1942, the editors of the American Life magazine addressed an open letter to the people of England. One thing we are sure we are not fighting for is to hold the British Empire together. We don't like to put the matter so bluntly, but we don't want you to have any illusions. If your strategists are planning a war to hold the British Empire together, they will sooner or later find themselves strategizing alone. Churchill responded a month later in his famous Mansion House speech. There should be no mistake about it in any quarter. We mean to hold our own. I have not become the King's First Minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. The degree to which British and American diplomats talked past each other over the issue was almost farcical. Americans struggled to understand why Britain wished to hold on to what they considered relics of a bygone age. The British tended to be genuinely incredulous at what they perceived to be American grandstanding on the issue, considering the country's own problems. "The more I hear," wrote Lord Halifax, referring to the treatment of African Americans in some parts of the US, "the more I resent the criticisms of us in India." American hostility to the empire was not just a popular view, but also one that reached the upper echelons of power. Throughout the war, Roosevelt was in particular keen on promoting Indian independence and the return of Hong Kong to China. "I do not want to be unkind or rude to the British, but in 1841, when you acquired Hong Kong, you did not acquire it by purchase," Roosevelt said to the Colonial Secretary, Oliver Stanley, in 1945. "Let me see, Mr. President," Stanley snapped back. That was about the time of the Mexican War, wasn't it? The bottom line was that Britain in 1941 was an imperial nation, and breaking that spirit was not easily done. "Our history and geography demand," said Eden, "that we should remain a world power with worldwide interests." The following years, however, made this far from certain. The first months of the Anglo-American alliance were ones of unmitigated disaster. With the US Pacific Fleet temporarily crippled, the Japanese swept through East Asia. Washington's Filipino protectorate was overwhelmed, along with several smaller outposts. These were large blows to the US's Far Eastern Imperium, but hardly disastrous to its prospects in the long term. For the British, the matter was very different. The fall of Hong Kong was followed by the collapse of a string of British possessions, most disastrously of all Singapore, described as London's Gibraltar of the East. The defeat shattered myths of British invincibility. Perhaps more importantly, it broke the trust colonial governments had in London to provide for their safety any longer. Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom, Prime Minister John Curtin announced. The collapse of the British position in the Pacific meant American commanders there, perhaps not unjustly to begin with, treated their war effort with contempt. As the US Navy turned the tide later that year at Midway, commanders and politicians alike saw potential opportunity in Britain's defeat. With it looking likely that the US would have to win back European colonial possessions, they hoped to return them to the British on the basis of trusteeships. In effect, the British would only reassert control with a commitment to the colony's independence. For the most part, this was successfully resisted by British diplomats, helped greatly by the fact that the imperial war effort improved over time, particularly with the string of decisive victories against the Japanese in Burma. In the end, the British would not lose a single colony in the Pacific, or anywhere else at the final peace settlement, but American hostility to London's continued rule in the region, especially India, was clear. There was more cooperation in the Western theatres. For most of 1942, only Britain had serious forces in the field against Germany and Italy, though they met with disaster at the Siege of Tobruk. Churchill, who received the news while sat next to Roosevelt, later described the shock he felt. "In this moment of crisis, the President was generous. What can we do to help?" the Prime Minister wrote was Roosevelt's simple question. Logistical challenges meant a serious Axis threat to Egypt and Suez was always unlikely. But Roosevelt's assistance at the nadir of Britain's war effort was genuine. even if the American ambassador in Cairo was privately scathing at what he called British bungling. The tide of the African campaign was decisively turned in October at El Alamein, whilst the Americans followed this up by undertaking their first major ground action in the West with Operation Torch. By mid-1943, North Africa and the Middle East were secure. But if the military contest with the Axis in the region was over, the diplomatic contest between the Allies had only just begun. In 1942, Wendell Willkie, former Republican candidate for the presidency, but now acting as Roosevelt's unofficial representative, landed in Cairo. His task was to show American commitment to the war and report back to Washington the state of the region. What Willkie actually returned with was a blazing attack on the British Empire. Although generally an Anglophile, Willkie was horrified by the squalor he saw in Egypt, for which he blamed the British. The rest of his Middle Eastern tour did not change his opinions. The veil, the fez, the sickness, the filth, the lack of education and modern industrial development, the arbitrariness of government, left him concerned America was being seen to support a colonial system he considered intolerable. Willkie did not have the best of relationships with Churchill. During his visit to the US in 1941, the Prime Minister thought it important to ingratiate himself with a likely successor to Roosevelt. Not wanting to meet openly with the president's political rival, though, Churchill had tried to arrange the audience with Willkie clandestinely. Attempting to call him from a retreat in Palm Beach, the switchboard operator, by accident, put the Prime Minister through to Roosevelt instead. "I am so glad to speak to you," gushed Churchill, before asking whether the man he thought was Willkie might join him on his train for part of the return journey to Washington. "Whom do you think you are speaking to?" the voice came back. "To Mr. Wendell Willkie, am I not?" "No," came the answer. "You are speaking to the President." "Who?" asked Churchill, not quite believing his ears. "You are speaking to me, Franklin Roosevelt," came the reply. After some small talk, Churchill brought the conversation to a close. "I presume you do not mind my having wished to speak to Wendell Willkie?" inquired Churchill. "No," Roosevelt responded. Unconvinced, Churchill chose to avoid the meeting Willkie had badly wanted so as to appear statesmanlike, to his permanent annoyance. The result was that the two men were not overly fond of each other, a situation further reinforced when Willkie, on a trip to Moscow, very publicly called for a second front, something Churchill had just spent a huge amount of energy convincing Stalin was for the moment impossible. A public rebuke in Parliament left Willkie sour, and his subsequent report to Roosevelt was hostile in the extreme to the British presence in the Middle East. In a national broadcast to an estimated 36 million Americans, Willkie, in a pointed dig at Britain, declared America was not fighting for profit or loot or territory, or mandatory power over the lives or governments of other people. The speech earned him a visit from the British ambassador, Lord Halifax, and a heated argument. The Americans, he reported back to London, believed we were running a bad show and the sooner we got out the better. In James Barr's words, there is perhaps no better summary of American thinking and policy towards Britain in the Middle East in the years that were to follow. After victory in North Africa came bickering over where to fight next. Before Torch, American planners had hoped to see a cross-channel invasion in 1943, which they correctly thought was the only way of bringing the war to an end. Churchill, on the other hand, wanted a Mediterranean campaign to potentially knock Italy out of the war and avoid such a direct clash with the Germans. US commanders were right that the Southern Front was never going to end the war, but the British were right that a cross-channel invasion in 1943, when the Luftwaffe still retained some aerial presence and the American army was yet to digest the lessons of Tunisia, could well have been a disaster. With the British army largely still the senior force at this point, London got its way, though Churchill could feel his once unassailable authority over the war effort slipping as the Americans gained more influence. His advocated for invasion of Italy met with mixed success, giving the Allies a foothold on the continent, but also repeatedly stalemating on the highly defensible peninsula. A cross-channel invasion would still have to be mounted. Throughout 1943 and 44, US troop numbers in Britain swelled. One commentator called it an invasion. Americans were bigger, richer and better fed than British civilians. There were disagreements, particularly over segregation in the American military, but for the most part, the two nationalities got on well. Less happy was the relationship between the British and American high commands. The alliance was fortunate to have Eisenhower as supreme commander. Arguably a middling general, though he crushed one of the greatest war machines in history convincingly enough, His real talent was for politics, placating the extreme personalities among the bickering high command to hold together a united front. Despite arguments over strategy, the eventual invasion of France, Operation Overlord, was the Atlantic Alliance at its best. On June 6, 1944, the Anglo-American-Canadian Armada landed in Normandy, and by late August, Paris had been liberated. But whilst the campaign to free Europe was ongoing, another battle was taking place across the Atlantic in the smoke-filled rooms of the Mount Washington Hotel. The official aim of the meeting between 44 nations, known as the Bretton Woods Conference, was to come up with a post-war financial order that would ensure global stability. The backdrop was a duel between British and American diplomats over who that order would benefit. The main protagonists were the US Treasury's Harry White and Britain's celebrity economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was undoubtedly one of the most intelligent men on either side of the Atlantic. His wit and eloquence might have made him a master diplomat, had he not, in Ben Styles' words, been more concerned with humiliating rather than converting his opponent. Styles sums up Keynes's plan for the post-war financial order in the following way. International transactions would be settled through a new international clearing bank. Neither national central banks or the ICB would actually hold foreign currency. Instead, national banks would buy and sell their own currencies among themselves by means of credits and debits, denominated in newly created bank money, to their ICB clearing account. Keynes later dubbed this bank money Bancor. Bancor was to have a fixed exchange rate with all members' currencies and gold. Members would add Bancors to their ICB account by exporting and have Bancors subtracted for importing, though limits would be placed on the amount of Bancors a country could accumulate through a trade surplus and on the amount of Bancor debt it could rack up through trade deficits, with each country's limit being set proportional to its percentage of world trade. Not incidentally, this method of establishing Bancor quotas was convivial to British interests, as Britain had little gold but needed to conduct lots of trade. Keynes's opponent was the relatively unknown Harry Dexter White, a competent and effective member of the US Treasury. Though generally Keynesian in economics, he was enormously sympathetic to the Soviet experiment and almost certainly arranged for confidential US documents to find their way into Moscow's hands. He believed much of the United States' woes in the 1930s had been from Britain and France's competitive devaluations of their currencies. Consequently, perhaps the key part of White's plan was to establish a fixed exchange rate. He hoped to elevate the dollar to the world's sole surrogate for gold, such that cross-border gold movements would no longer have the power to dictate changes in US monetary policy. This would be entirely set at the discretion of American experts, and then transmitted to the rest of the world by way of the fixed exchange rate. In sum, White's plan would bring about a world congenial to American interests, with the commitment of foreign competitors not to partake in trade discrimination or competitive devaluations. American exports would be protected. Conversely, Washington would have virtually unlimited discretion in its own economic policies. The actual outline of the two men's different plans for a new financial order are not particularly relevant to this discussion. The crux of the debate was that White wanted to make the US dollar, and only the dollar, synonymous with gold, whilst Keynes balked at the idea and the way it would undermine sterling permanently. Most of the issues surrounding the new system had been agreed before the conference convened, but on the key points not yet settled, particularly the issue of dollars being pegged to gold, it is clear that Keynes played a bad hand poorly and was outmanoeuvred by White. Keynes's predicament throughout the 2 years of negotiations prior, and then during the conference, was an unenviable one. The reality was that Britain was dependent on US financial aid, and would certainly leave the war with an enormous dollar shortage, meaning a loan from the American government was the only way to tide the country over until exports revived. It was thus thought Britain really had very little leverage in the negotiations. Yet tantalisingly, there was one other possibility. Wall Street, scared by the new proposed monetary policies, was prepared to lend as much as $5 billion to Britain if it walked from Bretton Woods. This loan would probably be on more stringent economic terms than that which Britain might obtain from the US government, but it would also come with no geopolitical strings, and crucially, it would have allowed British diplomats to outmaneuver White by threatening to abandon the conference. With no British cooperation, there would be no new international financial architecture, and White's plans to leave the US economically supreme would stall. A smart diplomat would have used Wall Street's offer to have obtained the best possible deal, but Keynes, partly because he was now too personally committed to the new financial architecture to walk, refused to even consider it. He recognised that doing so meant his negotiations at Bretton Woods and for a post-war loan were likely to be hard, writing, "There are quarters in the United States intending to use the grant of post-war credits to us as an opportunity for imposing the American conception of an international economic system." By this he meant abolition of imperial preference and exchange controls, alongside the enthronement of the dollar atop the international monetary system. His rival White was at the forefront of such quarters, yet Keynes resolutely refused the obvious alternative of standing up to the Treasury and borrowing privately. Thus, whilst the British delegation demanded that countries be able to set their own exchange rates, the American view, arguing for fixed rates, won over. Keynes objected to the dollar being a gold convertible currency, which in practical terms meant that sterling would be permanently usurped, whilst the United States, issuing a currency as good as gold, reaped the benefits of countries wanting to hold vast reserves of the dollar. Again, the British protested vigorously. Again, White simply ignored Keynes and snuck the clause in anyway. The refusal to contemplate walking away meant Bretton Woods is hard to even describe as a duel between the US and Britain. It was obvious White was going to win, and Keynes was just one more international delegate to be humoured. American victory at Bretton Woods was still not the end of the financial parley between both sides of the Atlantic. With the war in Europe clearly drawing to a close in autumn 1944, the question of Lend-Lease reared once more. Keynes was deployed again to negotiate stage 2 of the agreement, which was to cover Britain between victory in Europe and victory in the Pacific. The country was at this point so broke that its war effort against Japan took on a mercenary tinge, in that London was hoping to use the Pacific War as an opportunity to scale down war production and use any Lend-Lease supplies to boost exports. Naturally, the Americans were not fans of Britain using materials meant to prosecute the war to instead revive their exports, but Morgenthau was nonetheless keen the US reaction should not be harsh, instead treating Britain, as in his words, a friend who is broke, with Washington making it possible for her to gradually revive trade and meet its obligations. White protested it wasn't America's job to do such a thing, as restoring British prosperity to any degree would threaten the United States' position in the post-war world. He was subsequently annoyed that Roosevelt failed to take advantage of the Second Quebec Conference to obtain commercial concessions and a guarantee not to export Lend-Lease goods in return for Stage 2 aid. Roosevelt, who up until that point apparently hadn't realised just how impoverished Britain was, switched tact and declared, "I had no idea that England was broke. I will go over there and make a couple of talks and take over the British Empire." Consequently, he reinstated export restrictions on Lend-Lease goods and decreased promised aid by $600 million, brushing aside Morgenthau's objections that it would violate the spirit of Quebec. Churchill was not perturbed, convinced that if the programme was insufficient, Roosevelt would come through with another brainwave, as he called it. The president had other ideas, suffering not a brain wave but a brain hemorrhage a few months later, dying on the 12th of April 1945. Much of Roosevelt's diplomacy had been based on informal talks or was lost in his many piles of papers, which meant Britain was left with the very unknown quantity of Harry Truman as president. On the 8th of May, Germany surrendered and the war in Europe came to an end. Having only shipped about 1/6 of the arranged Lend-Lease supplies for 1945, the US now repossessed the rest. A further foundation of the wartime alliance was knocked away in July when Churchill's Conservatives were decisively beaten by Attlee's Labour at the general election. The new government had a similar policy to the last one, in that it hoped Phase 2 of Lend-Lease would allow them to begin the demobilisation of the economy, whilst America continued to provide aid. Instead, on August the 14th, Japan surrendered far earlier than expected. Truman abruptly terminated Lend-Lease aid just 3 days later, a crippling blow to Britain's recovery plans. Keynes, expecting a balance of payments deficit of $5.6 billion, announced the country faced a financial Dunkirk. And so, though by this point obviously ill, he was wheeled out for a final time to negotiate with the Americans. The government hoped for a reimbursement of around $4 billion for British pre-Lend-Lease purchases from the US, along with an acknowledgement that Britain was owed a moral debt for its war effort before American entry, apparently worth $3 billion according to one diplomat. Unsurprisingly, US officials were incredulous at the idea that, having bailed Britain out in the war, they were still under some kind of moral obligation. British hopes for aid on such a basis, what Keynes called justice, were firmly scuppered. The options open to the British then were either to secure a loan from Washington or impose a brutal round of austerity back home. After some disillusionment, the cabinet reluctantly decided on the former, and Keynes suggested that the US offer an interest-free $5 billion loan. The American negotiator, Clayton, offered 2% interest instead. This was the best Britain was going to get, but Keynes did not take it, instead having his head turned by a convoluted scheme from, of all people, his old rival White, that would see the US buy a large portion of Britain's sterling debt, something that would leave London only in need of $3 billion. The plan was implausible and rejected by the White House, but almost comically served to convince the Americans that Keynes was overstating British poverty and did not need $5 billion. He was told the offer was now $3.5 billion at 2% interest and $500 million to clean up Lend-Lease. Worse, any time the British seemed ready to sign, US diplomats seemed to find a new concession they wanted down the back of the sofa. "Why do you persecute us like this?" a depressed Keynes groaned when the Americans pushed for more concessions on British transitional rights under Bretton Woods. Eccles declared the US needed assurances it would have priority over Britain's other creditors. "You cannot treat a great nation as if it were a bankrupt company," a furious Keynes snapped. "No wonder that man is a Mormon," he privately muttered of Eccles. "No single woman could stand him." For all of this, the eventual terms of the Anglo-American loan were generous, except in one regard. 2% interest over 50 years was by no means exorbitant, though Keynes would remain bitter it was not interest-free for the remainder of his life. In return, the Americans gained an agreement for the removal of exchange controls in just 1 year, and so cemented their final ascendancy over an empire that had just 30 years earlier been the centre of world finance. The British Empire was not destroyed by the Second World War, or by American hostility. Indeed, the United States' intervention from December 1941 saved Britain from defeat and permanent impotence, but Bretton Woods ensured that America's hopes of keeping the empire weak and ultimately untenable would succeed. Yet in the coming years, when the removal of the demanded exchange controls and British evacuations from her Mediterranean commitments showed just how weak Britain really was, an enormous reassessment of US policy towards the British Empire would occur, until the most serious rupture in Anglo-American relations since the Trent Affair finally ended the Great Game. The Anglo-American loan was the culmination of the United States' attempts to undermine Britain's imperial project. The empire that Roosevelt had once assessed as a greater threat than the USSR was now economically beholden to Washington. Those concessions won in return for the loan were substantial, and American planners could with confidence look forward to the disintegration of Britain's dominions to their benefit. For sure, this was not the imperial rout that London had feared and some in the US had wanted. All British colonial possessions were returned at the end of the war. The loan itself meant there would be no fire sale of overseas obligations. Even imperial preference had technically survived, albeit in a heavily defanged form. But the scale of the US victory was about to be driven home, to the extent it surprised even American statesmen. In July 1947, as the terms of the loan had agreed, exchange controls were lifted and the pound was made convertible with the dollar. Some in Whitehall were inclined to welcome this rather than fear it, but Britain lacked the dollar reserves for such a policy. 2/3 of the previous year's loan had already been spent. Consequently, when full convertibility resumed in July, less than 2 months later, London was once more staring at the economic abyss, as nearly $900 million were converted in a few weeks. It meant reserves were again on the brink of exhaustion. The situation became so desperate that on the 20th of August, the government announced it was suspending convertibility. Had Washington still been the land of Harry White, this could well have been the destruction of the Anglo-American alliance. Yet the US did not seriously try to stop the British government revoking the agreement. In fact, it barely even protested. One of the key aims of American foreign policy during the war wrung from the British at such effort had been allowed to lapse. It's worth asking then why. The answer is twofold. In the first place, the pitiful fragility of the British economy put on full display in the crisis had genuinely shocked many in Washington. Was this not the perfidious Machiavellian empire whose pleas of poverty had always rung hollow? The answer was obviously not. It had suddenly become apparent that Britain was a far weaker power than previously thought. She was not trying to use US dollars to revive herself as a genuine rival to America, like White had suspected. In fact, it was using them to simply try and survive. The second reason was found in the East. Roosevelt had hoped to collaborate with Stalin at the end of the war, seeing the USSR as a more suitable partner than the supposedly outdated imperial apparatus in London. But as nation after nation was turned red, something the American public were alerted to in part by one Winston Churchill during a speech in Missouri, it was clear that the Soviet Union, not the British Empire, would be the greatest long-term threat to the American post-war order. In these circumstances, an enormous change in strategic thought occurred in Washington. There was no Damascene conversion towards ideological support for the British Empire, but it was now increasingly seen as a helpful, perhaps essential cornerstone in the burgeoning Cold War. With Europe and much of the world in ruins, neutral or communist, there was only the British Commonwealth left as a serious possible partner. Thus, when the Attlee government announced it was suspending convertibility once more so as to survive, there was little protest. Indeed, as the Iron Curtain was lowered over the Eastern Bloc and the Secretary of State, George Marshall, became convinced of Soviet hostility, the US was prepared to play a greater part than ever before in assisting Britain and the continent. The resulting Marshall Plan saw around $12 billion worth of aid over a few years transferred to Western Europe. The stated aim was to help the formerly occupied and war-ravaged nations rebuild, yet Britain, the undefeated power whose industry was most intact, received the largest share. The reasoning for this was self-evident. Britain was the most important country as far as Washington was concerned. As a State Department policy paper put it, British friendship and cooperation is necessary for American defence. The United Kingdom, the Dominions, colonies and dependencies form a worldwide network of strategically located territories of great military value. It is our objective that the integrity of this area be maintained, or as more crudely stated later by Frank Wisner, first head of covert operations for the CIA, whenever there is somewhere we want to destabilise, the British have an island nearby. Elsewhere, the Americans hoped that supporting the Empire would mean they would not be dragged into former British commitments, a possibility made all the more pressing by Attlee's personal desire for retrenchment where possible. The greatest test of this came over the Eastern Mediterranean, where London decided its presence in Greece and the Straits was too expensive to maintain. Washington was viscerally opposed to underwriting British aid here, but when London announced it would be cancelling support to Athens and Istanbul in March 1947, the State Department felt required to forestall any communist advance in the area, and offered a generous package of assistance delivered under the so-called Truman Doctrine. That this kind of scuttle did not happen more often was in part down to the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, whose intense patriotism and desire for London to remain a world power made him reluctant to undertake further retrenchment, even when it might have been, in the short term at least, economical to do so, Palestine being one example which will be discussed later. Bevin's greatest achievement was overseeing the formation of NATO, spurred on by the close Anglo-American cooperation during the Berlin blockade and subsequent airlift. The alliance confirmed there would be no retreat into isolationism for the US. The fact this was America's first ever peacetime commitment of such a kind represented a remarkable shift in foreign policy. For the British, it was an enormous strategic coup. The country would still have to play a significant role in Western European defence, and all the expense that came with it, whilst the Americans continued to openly question how long their commitment to NATO would last. But for now, the risk of facing a Soviet onslaught alone appeared to be over. The changing relationship of the American and British empires in the early post-war period also led to a strategic rethink in Britain. Even before Germany was defeated, Whitehall had begun to believe US aid would be crucial in maintaining the empire, and with communism now on the rise, they hoped Washington could indeed prove to be at least part of the solution to Britain's imperial problem. Whilst it was obvious that London would now be adjusting itself to an American-led world order, Fundamentally, the Commonwealth still had the makings of the third power bloc that was so often talked about. The empire had survived the loss of India and remained comfortable east of Suez, with possible new areas for consolidation outlined by Bevan. And there seemed to be no reason to think this improbable. Canada remained committed to the imperial cause, most explicitly displayed in their gift of $1 billion. Australia, after making their wartime appeal for American aid, now like the prodigal son had returned to the fold under the deeply pro-British Menzies. Even in South Africa, the ousting of Smuts by the Afrikaner National Party did not see an immediate imperial break. Indeed, in some respects, such as the pooling of dollars, it became more committed to the Commonwealth. The uniting factor for all the dominions was a deeply held suspicion about the growth of American power, which naturally drew them back into London's orbit. Yet the war and subsequent decolonisation of India had shown the old methods, slow devolution of power to local rulers whilst retaining control over imperial matters, were unlikely to work in the new world of emerging nationalism. Unable to face this threat alone, it was logical that British statesmen would once again look to the United States. Thus, with the Americans tacitly dropping their hostility to empire, could Washington's resources now be used to help manage Britain's imperium? Our aim, wrote Eden, should be to persuade the United States to assume the real burdens in such organisations, while retaining for ourselves as much political control, and hence prestige and world influence, as we can. He recognised the flaws in this strategy, not least the instinctive anti-colonialism that could never be wholly exercised from Washington, but increasingly agreed with Churchill it was the best possible solution. To what extent this policy can be judged as a success in the pre-Suez era is one of the most important aspects of the Anglo-American relationship. The best case study is undoubtedly the Middle East. With India lost, Bevan and the Chiefs of Staff identified it as the linchpin for what was sometimes termed the Third British Empire. Intersecting East and West, since the end of the First World War the region had been dominated by Britain and France. But in 1945, Paris's influence was clearly on the wane, and so Whitehall felt it an area best suited to British power. Since the Great Rebellion of 1916, Britain had been in alliance with the Hashemite rulers of Mesopotamia and the Levant. Egypt, though independent, remained heavily influenced by Britain, and the Trucial states to the south were generally extremely supportive of the British presence. And most importantly, much of the oil industry was either British-owned, or at least traded in sterling. It is hoped that by 1951, 82% of our oil supplies will be drawn from the Middle East, Bevan told the Cabinet in October 1949. This will present the largest single factor in balancing our overseas payments. What's more, with the Soviets poised in the north, it seemed London should be able to lay claim to American assistance in maintaining its hegemony in the region, if recent US policy was anything to go by. Indeed, the National Security Council concluded in a later 1952 report that, whatever the US can do to bolster both generally and locally the power of the UK will assist the UK in maintaining stability in the area, and will reduce the need for direct action by the US. An alliance of convenience seemed then to make sense. Britain wished to remain paramount in the Middle East. America wished to keep the region stable and immune to Soviet influence without the burden of direct intervention. Theoretically, this entente should have worked. On a case-by-case basis, it fell apart almost immediately. The Mandate of Palestine, governed by London since Allenby took Jerusalem 3 decades earlier, had long been a thorn in the British side. Having withdrawn from all but the Suez Canal zone in Egypt at the end of the Second World War, Whitehall viewed the territory as a potential new base for British power in the region. The problem they faced, however, was dogged resistance from a large section of the local and recently arrived Jewish population. By 1947, the Zionist movement, promoting the need for a Jewish homeland, was an increasingly powerful idea for many in the aftermath of the war's atrocities. During the conflict, Britain had attempted to maintain a balance between the Arab and Jewish populations by cutting off immigration to the territory, though this had inadvertently condemned many in Europe to death. Thousands of Jews nonetheless served in the British Army, but some paramilitary groups, like Irgun, responded with a campaign of terrorism against the local Palestinian government. In 1945, Palestine was an attractive prospect for Jewish refugees from Europe. This struck panic into hearts at Whitehall. Such a large influx could not only spark outright war between the Jewish and Arab populations, it would also make demands for British evacuation almost incontestable. To make things even more complex, Britain was not dealing with this problem alone. In Washington, President Truman was frequently petitioned by Zionist groups, quipping that he had more Jews than Arabs in his electorate. Truman put pressure on the British to allow in a significant number of refugees. The ensuing squabble was the first sign that the new Anglo-American alliance over the British Empire was not as stable as it might seem when other priorities overrode US foreign policy. By August 1945, Truman was telling reporters his aim was to let as many Jews into Palestine as possible and still maintain civil peace. Yet British inquiries about whether they would have US assistance in maintaining this peace were met with silence. The president eventually settled on the number of 100,000 refugees, a figure not exactly received with delight in Whitehall. Bevan threatened to publicly demand American military aid in policing the chaos he thought such a number would bring, and Truman quietly backed off. This was of little consolation to the British, struggling with a situation that was rapidly unravelling. On the 31st of October, 150 coordinated attacks were launched against Palestinian railway networks by terrorist groups. To try and recruit American aid in hammering out a deal that would allow the British to at least keep bases in Palestine, Bevan proposed a joint committee of inquiry to investigate a solution. But this then had the adverse effect, with several American members convincing themselves upon seeing Palestine that the British were the real problem in Arab-Jewish tensions, and that peace only required their evacuation. The resulting report was an awkward compromise where the proposal for 100,000 refugees was reaffirmed, in return for vague support for the suppression of terrorism by the British. The committee ignored everybody's responsibility but ours, muttered Attlee, who also more ironically stated, "The United States wants her interests at our expense." And expense was increasingly the overriding factor, as Palestine seemed to become more uncontrollable by the day. British raids on the Jewish Agency, effectively an Israeli government-in-waiting, drew condemnation from Truman. In response, Attlee declared Britain had recovered documents linking the agency to terrorist groups. Scared by this, Ergun staged the King David Hotel bombing on the 22nd of July 1946, hoping to destroy the documents. 91 people were killed. Truman was firm in his condemnation, as indeed were most of the Jewish community, but it was a demoralising blow to the British, whose fortunes elsewhere were also looking grim. Bevan had hoped to reach an agreement with Egypt that would allow Britain to close its Suez base and focus attention on Palestine, but that had stalled over Cairo's claims to the Sudan. By early 1947, with no settlement between Arabs and Jews in sight, the British seemed to have reached a dead end, and Bevan suggested referring the case to the United Nations. This was originally a bluff, as the Foreign Secretary believed Jews would recoil at the uncertainty of UN involvement and become more amenable to an agreement with London. Instead, Ergun responded by attacking the British Officers' Club in Jerusalem. At the same time, Zionist sympathising groups in America were funding an ever-increasing amount of boats bringing refugees from Europe to Palestine illegally. The Royal Navy was reduced to having to try and stop them within the few miles of British-owned water off the coast. Unsurprisingly, the UN Special Committee concluded the mandate had to be ended as soon as was possible, but their proposed partition of the territory between Arabs and Jews annoyed Attlee, who thought it unworkable and unfair on the Arabs. London announced if the proposal did not have the consent of both parties, it would withdraw and leave some alternative authority to implement the plan. When the vote passed, in part thanks to US pressure on those European countries receiving Marshall aid, the British scuttle of Palestine became complete. As violence continued to spread, Washington at the last moment panicked that such a sudden British evacuation would create a chaos the Soviets could step into. Marshall only now offered US support to Bevan, who rejected it as too little too late. The British bailed out and left a war in their wake. Having helped bring an end to British rule in Palestine, the US now moved on to torpedoing London's next proposal for the region. Abdullah, King of Jordan, had been Britain's ally since 1916. Whitehall's ambassador and the King's most trusted advisor, Alec Kirkbride, had fought alongside Lawrence and Faisal in the Great War, whilst Britain officered and subsidised Jordan's professional Arab Legion. Abdullah had long dreamt of some kind of union for the territories in the Levant, and with both the French and British withdrawing formal rule, this Greater Syria proposal, as it was termed, suddenly seemed like a distinct possibility, as British policymakers finally accepted Kirkbride's urgings. For the Americans, rumours of this proposal would not do. It threatened in particular to block their new pipeline being built to connect Saudi oil fields with the Mediterranean, known as TAP Line. Since American investors held a majority of the shares in Aramco, the company in control of Saudi oil, the millions of dollars saved by the pipeline in transportation fees would be of direct benefit to them. A united Levant, controlled by the Saudis' Hashemite rivals, could well block this. However, there was currently no evidence of a Greater Syria scheme the US could act on. To ascertain the situation, the Americans managed to find another Roosevelt from their apparently endless supply that they could send out clandestinely. Posing as a journalist, he obtained an interview with Abdullah, who unsurprisingly feigned ignorance. But Kirkbride proved more forthcoming. This idea of separate Syrian and Lebanese republics, that's a lot of nonsense. This all used to be one country, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, and what we call Palestine too. It was all Syria. Wasn't till the Versailles Peace Conference and all that stuff came along that it was split up. One kingdom for the whole area could stand up to Soviet penetration, where 3 or 4 states can't possibly. Having acquired the confession they needed, the State Department was able to apply pressure in Iraq and Jordan to scupper the scheme. Ultimately, Abdullah would succeed in seizing the West Bank in the 1948 war, but fail in his ambition to unite the whole Levant. For the British, it was yet another worrying sign that the US was not as disinterested in the region as they made out. Greater Syria was soon forgotten though, for a far worse crisis was about to challenge London's power in the region. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company had long been a vital British asset. Its history went back to the start of the century, when an Englishman had purchased a concession to search for oil from the Shah. Initially, it looked like Persia had got the better end of the deal, as attempts to find oil proved fruitless. But in 1908 it was finally struck, with a refinery built in Abadan 5 years later. At that point, a young and energetic First Lord of the Admiralty named Winston Churchill bought a controlling stake in the industry for the British government. By 1950, the company's oil revenues contributed a large sum to Britain's balance of payments. The Iranian government had renegotiated the agreement in 1933, but not unjustly considering the accounting trickery that went on in the company to hide the true level of profit, still felt its share of the dividends was too small. This was compounded by events in Saudi Arabia. Here, the Americans had a very similar arrangement to the British with Riyadh. Britain had originally been the Saudis' key ally in the region, but by this time Washington had fairly clearly ousted London. The British were a people of but, an annoyed Ibn Saud once huffed. They will give you assurances, but always at the end, but. Clearly a boob guy. Methodical pressure from the king had eventually seen the Americans concede what became known as a 50-50 split with the Saudi government. The theory of the deal sounds obvious, though in practicality it actually ended up with Washington itself, rather than Aramco subsidising Ibn Saud. Unsurprisingly, this type of arrangement was as anathema to the British as it was tempting to Iran, yet one of the leading figures in the Iranian parliament, Mossadegh, went a step further in calling for full nationalisation of the oil industry. This was felt to be an extreme demand by both the British and Americans, and consequently met with scorn initially. In this, they were supported by the Iranian Prime Minister Razmarah, who, though in favour of a 50-50 deal a la Aramco, argued outright nationalisation would be disastrous, as it would be both illegal and damaging, for he believed the country lacked the expertise and resources to run the industry independently. Though they dragged their heels, by late February, Razmarah had secured a commitment from the company to discuss a 50-50 split, but was assassinated before the deal could progress. Iran's parliament subsequently voted for nationalisation, and 2 months later, Mossadegh himself was appointed Prime Minister. For their part, the Americans were initially against nationalisation for the obvious reason that the Saudis may have the same idea if it was pushed through in Iran, but in the face of Mossadegh's commitment to the policy and the Shah's refusal to challenge him, they basically concluded it was inevitable. This, combined with suggestions that London make the process easier by waiving their right to compensation, further served to annoy the British. The new Foreign Secretary, Morrison, increasingly looked to drastic measures, drawing up plans to support a declaration of independence from southern Iranian tribes by landing troops. Acheson, the also relatively new, though far more experienced Secretary of State, thought this sheer madness. His initial statement was even-handed, arguing that Iran needed more control over its oil, but that a unilateral cancellation of the contract would have serious effects. This was not the way Whitehall was used to being treated. He talks to us as if we were two Balkan countries being lectured in 1911 by Sir Edward Grey, was one Conservative MP's response. Under American pressure, the British agreed to offer major concessions, but they were too late, and Mossadegh refused to contemplate anything other than full nationalisation. It was now Washington's turn to feel frustration. Had the Prime Minister considered how Iran would actually operate the oil fields without British aid? The US ambassador asked. Too bad for us, was Mossadegh's response. If the industry collapses and no money comes, and disorder and communism follow, it will be your fault entirely. In 1951, Churchill returned to office determined to settle the matter. By this point, an oil blockade organised by Attlee was clearly working. Mossadegh finally offered to negotiate in return for economic aid, terms abruptly withdrawn in the face of domestic disturbance. For most in Whitehall, this was the final straw, and they began looking at ways to oust the Prime Minister. Acheson was uninterested and distrustful of the plot, supported by the CIA, which expected Mossadegh to have enough popular support to remain in power until at least 1954. The change came with the election of war hero Dwight Eisenhower as president in 1952, though even then a reversal in policy did not come about immediately. The new Secretary of State, Dulles, was undoubtedly competent, but not received with enthusiasm in London. Dull, duller, Dulles, was Churchill's comment. He was keen on American leadership of the world order, and thought Britain a now clearly declining power, whose clumsy behaviour was encouraging nationalists like Mossadegh. When Churchill crossed the Atlantic to meet Eisenhower in early 1953, the new president recorded Winston had an almost childlike faith in the Anglo-American alliance. Ike initially thought Mossadegh was preferable to the communist alternative, and even talked of subsidising Iran in the face of the British blockade. What changed his mind was that the Prime Minister appeared to be moving away from his previous alliance with the country's clerics, and instead gravitating towards the Communist Two-Day Party, who were now openly supporting him. Finally, convinced they also could no longer work with Mossadegh, the CIA and MI6 began plotting his downfall. Operation Ajax is an interesting story, but one that cannot be explained in any depth here. Basically, as the result of Anglo-American clandestine actions, Mossadegh was toppled and the Shah restored to full power. In the aftermath, a new oil deal was agreed, which, though giving the British less of a stake, still saved them from the potential horror of nationalisation. Yet in the heat of success, Whitehall seemed to forget just how opposed America had previously been to British intervention. Only when they had helped convince Washington that Iran was liable to fall to communism, which would have threatened US interests, did Washington decide to act. But in London, a different lesson was learned. The Americans had little to do with our eviction. They welcomed and facilitated our return and rehabilitation, crowed one diplomat. Such notions were soon to be disabused by the coming crisis in Egypt. This country had been influenced by London since British troops had first intervened in 1882 to restore the recently overthrown Khedive. Cairo gained formal independence in 1922 and agreed a treaty with the British in 1936. But whilst Farouk held the throne, Whitehall was still able to influence the country to some degree through a mixture of threats and incentives. Farouk's corpulent form and clearly quite loose interpretation of Islam, combined with his alleged lapdog status, did not serve to endear him to the people. Yet it took the influence of the United States to topple his crown. In 1952, they supported a coup by the Free Officers Movement. Shortly thereafter, Gamal Abdel Nasser rose to power. The change in leadership surprised the British, but did not alter their strategy, which was to agree a treaty that would allow them to abandon the Suez Canal base except for technicians, with rights to return in case of a Soviet invasion of the region. The new government in Cairo was naturally fearful of making any concession that could seem like selling out, so would only consider a limited 7-year agreement with non-uniformed technicians remaining in the base. The reaction in London was one of frustration and rage. Hardliners on the Tory backbenches now objected to any treaty at all, whilst an assailed Eden blamed the influence of the US in Cairo for Egyptian intransigence. Yet it was uncomfortably clear that nothing but that influence could induce the Egyptians to sign. In 1953, Churchill asked Eisenhower to withhold economic aid to Egypt until a treaty was agreed. The president's response was to inquire whether Britain would be willing to join the US in opposing China's entry into the United Nations. It increasingly seemed as if it was Washington roping Britain into supporting its foreign policy rather than vice versa. Nonetheless, Dulles finally agreed that Nasser should be told American aid would depend on Egypt keeping all the terms of a treaty. In response, the British gave way on the question of technician uniforms and reduced the agreement length to 7 years. Initially, the British hoped that this would pave the way for a revival of their waning Middle Eastern power. They were not unsympathetic to the three officers, and Nasser was compared to a figure in the mould of Ataturk, an honest realist they could work with. Yet the involvement of Washington seemed to hang over the Canal Base Agreement like a dark cloud. British negotiators were convinced the US ambassador in Cairo, Caffery, had long been torpedoing their efforts. That it was only when the US agreed to support Britain an agreement was reached, offered a humiliating indication that British strength was rapidly on the wane. US influence of Cairo's policy was all the more disconcerting in view of Egypt's growing rivalry with Britain's last major partner in the region, Iraq. Whitehall hoped to establish the kingdom as the centre of a new alliance known as the Baghdad Pact to resist Soviet influence. Nasser, who was described as holding an almost pathological hatred for Iraq, was determined to prevent something that could usurp Egypt's claim to Arab leadership, and worked with Saudi Arabia to block Jordan's entry to London's fury. Yet at the same time, Washington was beginning to lose its patience with the Egyptian Prime Minister. Dulles' pet project had been a peace deal between Egypt and Israel, but Nasser continued to drag his feet, whilst hoping to secure a large arms purchase from America. Dulles feared such weapons would be used against Israel. With negotiations seemingly at an impasse, Nasser turned to the Soviets, who agreed to supply him. He appears to have only intended this as a warning shot to the US, but Dulles was incensed at what he viewed as a betrayal. Soon after, at the UN, he met the new British Foreign Secretary, Macmillan, taking over from the now Prime Minister Eden. The two men gelled immediately, and spent the day winding each other up over Egypt. Dulles lauded the British Empire to Macmillan, and asked him whether he thought Britain had enough troops to reoccupy Cairo. The Foreign Secretary thought they did. For the British, the final straw came in March 1956, when the leader of Jordan's Arab Legion and advisor to the new king, Lub Pasha, was dismissed. Eden blamed Nasser personally for pressuring the monarch to do so. In fact, the Egyptian Prime Minister had done nothing of the sort, and was as surprised as the British by Glub's dismissal. But in Whitehall, it appeared to be the final proof that Nasser was actively working to eject Britain from everywhere in the Middle East. "It's him or us, don't forget that," Eden declared to one colleague. When Whitehall received intelligence reports that Nasser had agreed to collectivise the Egyptian economy in return for Russian aid and was preparing to invade Israel, it was decided that he had to go. The following week saw plans made to increase support for Britain's Arab allies and detach Saudi Arabia as Egypt's partner, along with options for destabilising Nasser domestically. But Eden, at this point a sick man whose nerves were clearly shot, disliked such a complex game. His solution, as he shouted down the phone to one colleague, was to simply have Nasser murdered. Yet, apart from the Prime Minister's unhinged babbling, Britain seemed to be in luck. It was well understood ousting Nasser without active support from Washington would be difficult. But American opinions were also hardening. Egypt had finally confirmed there would be no peace treaty with Israel, and it was felt in the US that Cairo had strung them along dishonestly. At a conference with Lloyd, Macmillan's replacement at the Foreign Office after he moved to the Exchequer, Dulles said the US might have to ditch Nasser. When he heard of it, Eden assumed ditch to mean Washington was also looking at regime change in Egypt, and thus began a series of disastrous miscommunications. Eisenhower's actual preference was to switch US focus in the Middle East and strengthen the relationship with Saudi Arabia. The new king, previously an Egyptian ally but now increasingly concerned by Nasser's popularity, seemed like a much better bet from the American perspective, and Saud subsequently expelled an Egyptian military mission from his country. Although both were working to different objectives, Britain and the US had eventually arrived at the same result, with Nasser now isolated in the Arab world. The final plank left to remove seemed to be funding for the Aswan Dam, part of Egypt's economic modernisation, and promised by both countries a year earlier. Cancelling it would leave the Soviets the choice of either having to pick up the whole tab or withdrawing their influence as well from Egypt. Ironically, the British now hesitated, prophetically sensing this final step would bring reprisals from NASA. Dulles ignored them and announced the decision anyway, with the British following suit. When the Russians refused to fund the whole project, NASA resorted to a desperate ploy and announced its intention to nationalise the Suez Canal so as to use its tolls to pay for the dam. The canal was mainly owned by British and French shareholders, London having purchased its stake from the then bankrupt Khedive in 1875. Though the logic of holding the canal so as to shorten the route to India was long dead, 2/3 of British oil still passed through it. NASA has his boot on our windpipe, screeched Eden. Although shareholders were compensated fairly for the nationalisation, the move was thought to break the 1954 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, an agreement Eden had been instrumental in forcing through over the objections of Tory hardliners, who now jeered they'd been right about NASA all along. Worse, the popularity of the nationalisation would go a long way to restoring NASA's position as leader of the Arab world. Hit him, Nuri, the Prime Minister of Iraq, who was sat next to Eden when he received the news, advised. Hit him hard and hit him now. Had the British been able to do so, they would probably have gotten away with it. In Washington, support for ousting NASA had reached boiling point. United States Admiral R.A. Burke, who would later in the crisis offer to blow the Royal Navy from the Mediterranean, at this point argued NASA must be broken, and that if Britain resorted to force to do so, we should declare ourselves in support of their action. The Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson, likewise told Eisenhower on the 12th of August that the United States should assure Britain and France they had our moral support, and that they should go on in. As it was, the military was unprepared to strike and would need at least 6 weeks, by which time public anger throughout the West had largely died down. The solution was to find an alternative pretext for intervention, which the French were about to provide. The plan was that Israel, to whom NASA had immediately closed the canal, would invade and lunge towards Suez. Britain and France would then intervene as peacekeepers to secure the canal for international use. Whitehall was sceptical about working with the Israelis, which could upset their Arab allies, but Nouri himself encouraged Britain to work with Tel Aviv. The remaining problem then was the US. Whilst belligerence had seemed to be the order of the day in July and early August, opinions had since become less sure, not least because of Ike and Dulles' own reservations. The British attempted to gain an answer as to whether the Americans would support firm action against Egypt, or at least stand aside. As one diplomat told Dulles, the British hoped they would be with them in this determination, but if we could not, they would understand and our friendship would be unimpaired. Dulles and Eisenhower, however, feared the impact such action would have on international opinion. On the other hand, Eisenhower also talked of not letting NASA get away with this action. In fact, for all he waffled on about our people's feelings being against military action, as John Charmley points out, Washington never actually made clear they would oppose it. The closest Ike probably came was a letter to Eden on the 8th of September, in which he argued intervention might cause a serious misunderstanding between our two countries. Yet if American policy was erratic, they could perhaps with justification argue this was because London was not being straight with them. Eden had taken from his correspondence with Eisenhower and Macmillan's meetings with Dulles that so long as Britain went through the motions of looking for a diplomatic solution, the US would not oppose military action. What actually happened when Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula and Operation Musketeer was launched in November was that the collusion appeared obvious to everyone, and Britain's negotiations in the UN were seen as being in bad faith. Although militarily the campaign was a near complete success, Washington was furious. A genuine protest would have surprised the British. That the US actually took action against their ally left London utterly shell-shocked. They were warned America was drafting a UN resolution supporting economic sanctions against Britain and France. Ike threatened to sink the pound, whilst the US Sixth Fleet literally shadowed and harassed the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. This was then compounded by Macmillan, who morphed from being an extreme hawk to complete dove and lied about how much had drained from Britain's currency reserves. Arguably, Britain could have survived all of these problems. Had Macmillan given the actual figure of the drain on British reserves, 30 million rather than 100, the government might not have panicked so completely. Yet it's worth considering that Egypt was not some passive player in this. Although its military was largely beaten, the population had rallied around Nasser, and how the British genuinely planned to oust him after seizing Suez is not clear. Kissinger later commented for this reason that though Musketeer was a flawed plan, the question remained over whether the US really needed to be so brutal with its alleged allies. Whatever the case, the shock of US hostility was enough for Eden to call off the operation. Within 2 years, the Iraqi monarchy had fallen, and British influence in the Middle East was nearly extinguished. In the aftermath, the lid that seemed to have been kept on American anti-colonialism for a decade was very clearly blown. Far from seeking to prop up British control even nominally any longer, Eisenhower and Dulles, in George Herring's words, now rejoiced that European influence in the region was on the wane. Washington tried to step into the gap with the Eisenhower Doctrine, which would see them intervene in Syria and Lebanon in the near future, though they were also given short shrift by Nasser, who denounced it as imperialism by other means. British hopes of maintaining the empire in part through the resources of the United States were gone. Macmillan soon after ascended the premiership and re-established the relationship, but he knew under what terms he was doing so. "We must play Greeks to the Romans," he announced. Finding a closing date for the Anglo-American competition is impossible. There was no set moment when London gave up the ghost, and to some extent there never has been. Britain continued to maintain a formal empire for several years after Suez, and the hallmarks of the British financial order only really disintegrated in full with its entry into the EEC in 1973. Fundamentally, Britain remains a sovereign country, and negotiates with America as such, but hopes of controlling a Commonwealth able to stand shoulder to shoulder with Washington are long dead. A series such as this, focusing effectively on a single issue, cannot but give off the impression that the Anglo-American competition has been the reason for British decline and American ascendancy. This, it must be made clear, is not true and represents only part of that story. The competition was never a zero-sum game where one power had to lose as decisively as Britain did, whilst the other had to win as decisively as the United States has. It's possible to imagine a world where there were no great wars in the 20th century and both remained great powers of a relatively equal footing. That the United States has dominated the globe so successfully since 1945, whilst Britain has reduced itself so comprehensively, has as much to do with domestic policy as competition in the Middle East or squabbles over imperial preference. And from a British perspective, of all the possible powers that could have taken over from British hegemony in the 20th century, the United States is surely the most benevolent for a commercial power like London that relies on freedom of the seas and a relatively stable financial system. Perhaps that in part explains why British foreign policy has tended to see siding with the United States as a sort of duty compared with other European nations. Whatever the case, nothing can alter the fact that Anglo-American history from 1814 has been a story of one power's rise and one power's decline.